Howdy, everyone. I am going to do a talk on this concept that's been coming up quite a bit lately. I think this is one of the new waves of interest right now in education, which is to uh, start working with this thing called cognitive engagement. It's not a new concept, right? But as many things happen within society and especially teaching, we sort of bounce from one idea to the next. And yeah, so I'm going to sort of go through what's going on right now and have a sort of critical look at some of the trends that are going on and to talk through it a bit more, think more deeply about what we really mean by cognitive engagement and what we can really do to better engage our students. So, sort of underlying or main question that is often asked is why are my students not cognitively engaged? Seems like, you know, a right kind of question to ask. It doesn't seem like there's something wrong with it. So when we ask that question, the assumption that tends to be there is that the students are the cause, right? They're the cause of the difficulty, right? They're the reason why they're not cognitively engaged, okay? So the answer um, is often some collection of changed teaching methods, right? That makes sense, right? If you think that students are on some level the cause, you might think that if we just change our teaching methods, it'll grab their attention more, and the classes will just overall be better, okay? So the answers tend to come in the form of, if you're talking about professional development or the ways in which, we do our PLCs, professional learning communities, we might start going back to some concepts like project-based learning, Bloom's taxonomy, where we look at the hierarchy of questions and tasks that we're engaging our students with. We might look at things like what web-based tools are out there that we can use in the classroom more. There's been long discussion about hands-on and experiential learning, and of course, small group cooperative learning, getting students into small groups and all that. All of these things have been talked about and talked about and talked about in many forms over many decades. And the one that probably gets a lot of attention now is the web-based tools. Okay, so how about that? What if we were to keep engaging with these kinds of approaches and form our answers in this way? What if we had more project-based learning? We were way up the scale. Things like analysis, evaluation, creation, right? What if we were using more web-based tools? What if we had more hands-on experiences? And what if we were doing a lot more small group cooperative learning? Would that change the environment of the classroom? And of course, the answer is yes, right? So it seems like, why would we not take these things on? And my answer is, well, you should. These are all good things to aim for, right? Um, but at the end of the day, will they all sort of create a deeper change that we might be looking for here, right? So here's the issue, right? Students, especially everywhere, but students that are really getting hit hard by the ways in which our society is, kind of jacked up. This is what they're seeing. Let's talk about this a bit more, right? They're seeing that the only way to really survive in our society is to chase the dollar, right? They're also seeing that there's been a very long history of keeping, specific groups of people away from the dollar. And even if they don't know the details on their own, they know that they're living in a way in a situation that's not of their making, and nobody really seems to be doing very well, especially in many pockets around our society. So it's really hard to see, except for maybe on TV. And maybe they're seeing that really their real future is just being part of a larger labor chain, and that they just need to consider working at some entry level job, and that's about as much as or they're going to make, right? If they don't engage in something much riskier than that. And that really the only people in the society who make it anyway are just wealthy, rich people who were born wealthy and rich, right? There's not much else that they can do about that, at least in their personal life, if they weren't born wealthy and rich. And the only real escape from all that is being able to shop and consume, and sort of build their experiences around that. So project-based learning and all those are all good things. But at the end of the day, there's larger issues that school is connected to, that learning is connected to, and it's not necessarily connected to the larger problems. And if we look at the school environments themselves, there's a lot of things going on in schools that aren't really protecting kids emotionally and sort of otherwise socially. There's a lot of practices in schools that are really targeted at specific groups of kids, right? And kids who push back in some ways. Now, I'm not saying that they're pushing back in the best possible way. They thought it all through, but they might just simply be really frustrated with what's going on in life overall, and then that finds a way into the school itself, and you just constantly feel like you're a left behind person. Okay? So let's really look at this one more time here. So if the assumption is that the students are the cause and that the answer is that we can just change teaching methods, right? That's a narrowed approach to trying to deal with some of these issues. But all of the other issues are sort of beating on cognitive engagement, beating it down. So on some level, this kind of thinking is deficit thinking because it's putting the student at the cause of the problem, right? Even if we're sort of doing it softly and not really paying attention to it in our head, that's where things get really funky because most people think that they're just not, they're not doing it because they're not explicitly saying it. But we might be doing it even though we don't think we are, right? So this is one of the sort of soft ways that we engage in deficit thinking is when we say, how do I get my students to engage cognitively better? What we're saying is that underlying that is that we think the student is the problem, right? And so we're going to make some adjustments into teaching. Now here's that list again, right? And so what's that really about? Well, when you look at them together, it's sort of this limited social cognitivist pseudo-constructivist approach. It's very limited in its approach. Now, again, I'm not saying don't do those things. What I'm saying is don't only do those things. It needs to be part of a larger package, right? So, why are my students not cognitively engaged? Well, maybe we need to reframe that question. What keeps my students from being cognitively engaged? Now, it's a bit of a subtle shift, right? You could read the first question and not read it as a deficit-minded way of thinking that leads to these sort of limited ways of educating or re-educating or shaping our education. But this is a lot more explicitly sort of drawing attention to larger external things that might be at play, right? So here's a very, haphazard, I'm just throwing things at the wall list of answers. There's really not much organization to it. But if you look down, you see feeling devalued, feeling dehumanized, low self-efficacy and feelings of inadequacy, chronic bad stress, continuous negative relationships, feeling emotionally disconnected, content is consistently too difficult, anxiety, content lacks relevance, no or little variety in learning experiences, teacher is too emotionally distant, school climate is uncaring, negative, and hostile, and it's disconnected from students' experiences. That's a list of me just sort of spitballing possibilities of what might be at play in various schools and various districts. It doesn't mean all of them are at play. It doesn't mean that all of them need to be considered because in many schools there's some uh, a lot of good stuff going on. So now it's just a matter of sort of honing into things that might be very specific to where you're teaching, right? So that first question, why are my students not cognitively engaged? Well, what this is doing is it's sort of limiting the kind of answers that we can draw out of the swamp, right? So what gets sort of fished out of the swamp, and I'm just so you know, I'm like pro swamp. I think they're amazing ecosystems. That's just from the biologist to me. Um, but drawing these sort of the answers that get drawn out are typically the two that are highlighted there, and so we keep sort of seeing cognitive engagement through those answers, those possible answers. No or little variety in learning experiences, and disconnected from students' experiences. So, um, with those sort of two in mind, we think that maybe we can, you know, re invigorate the soil of learning with different nutrients that are needed. But the reality is that that soil is probably more unhealthy than we think. And just adding a few nutrients here and there is probably not going to be enough. So, engagement and interest. Engagement is dehumanized because, in a way, we're trying to, whether it's intentional or not, what we're trying to do is sort of control for that, at least in the way that this is being framed. And again, it's not overtly, it's not explicitly stated that way, but there's this sort of underlying, like, we're gonna somehow be able to, tweak the equalizer here, and we're trying to control for the outcome that we're looking for here. That's not always the best approach. In fact, it's usually not a good approach in general, right? We're talking about human beings in the classroom here. So, where do we go from here? Well, there's sort of two paths for creating change. And the first one I'm calling sort of the low hanging fruit mindset. And that sort of denotes something really negative right away. But let me sort of work with a metaphor here for a second. If I'm, outside and there's some low hanging fruit and I'm hungry, I reach up and eat the food, and that does a positive thing for me. So, in a sense, low hanging fruit isn't always bad, right? And it doesn't mean just because it is low hanging fruit that we shouldn't eat it. It just means it's not all of the fruit that's there, right? I think we're running out of space here in the metaphor, but you get the idea, right? So in the world of education, there's a lot of low hanging fruit that we tend to turn towards when we're looking for answers, when we're trying to change our professional practices, and so the reason why we tend to do that is because our job is really intense, right? Our job is filled from from day to night. There's really, it's something that's always on our mind. So to make changes in education is difficult because of all the things that we do. Um, there's 1,000 things that we do in a day, and making one sort of drastic change affects all of them all at once, and that's an overwhelming feeling. So we have this desire to sort of look at things and poke at things that tend to be a little bit simpler, right? Because we don't want to upend the entire experience and start from scratch. So, I get that, right? Uh, but it is a bit of a low hanging fruit mindset because we're just trying to grab the things that we can that are sort of within our reach right away. So, the problems with that, though, so the plus side is that you can do some pretty positive things. And I have sort of visually put up here a bunch of web-based, tools and learning experiences that, among the many, these are just ones that I picked up. A lot of them my kids use, or teachers are using with my kids in elementary school right now. Anyway, but they tend to be, even though they're helpful, they also tend to be a bit gimmicky, right? They can be sometimes not just. I'm not talking about just the things up here. Some of them are really good, but there tends to be a sort of gimmickiness to the way in which the low hanging fruit is there. They're kind of attached to superficial thinking. They're sort of simplistic answers and practices. and technology is often posed as the answer to many deeper problems, and of course it can't do all those things. Um, and the reality is that these gimmicky, it's very profitable to create something gimmicky and attractive that teachers and students can use sort of tomorrow, right? And we oftentimes have that mentality of we want something that we can do tomorrow, right? And that kind of drives our thinking too. But these are really sort of these drive-by efforts. They are generally easier to implement, but they don't have very long-term, very good long-term effects, right? There's very little long-term effects. Um, the thing is, like I said, they can be helpful. So it's not that we shouldn't do them. We could probably see them as part of the bigger picture, though, right? So what's the bigger picture, right? What's the other path of creating change? Well, it's a more long-term community commitment towards thriving together, right? And I talk about this all the time now, and I know that there's a sort of an overwhelming element to thinking about things. Like on one hand, yes, we want to aim towards something that's this good, but what can we do about it tomorrow? So we sort of feel this push and pull. Um, so let me sort of walk through this one, right? But this would happen in sort of stages of professional community, right? The professional community itself going through stages of development. There would be sort of a cooperative, community-based work uh, that we do together that's not really tied to somebody else's profit, right? There's this long-term, really sort of long-term commitments that we make to seeing this through and seeing that kind of significant growth as opposed to just turning the dials on the equalizer a bit here. This is more about a very larger, pervasive, integrated change. And obviously, this requires a great deal more work, more time. Um, but if we are committed to it, the kind of changes that we really want will emerge, right? At least much more so than by tweaking the equalizer. Now, I'm going to Finland here for a second. Finland has gotten a lot of attention. And it started when they just by chance showed up at the top of the international metric called PISA with reading and math maybe about 10 years or so ago. And they were just as surprised as anybody else. They were going, "What? You're talking to me? Like us?" And here's what they and if you look at their numbers now, they're China is at the top all of the time. Um, you know, uh, Good for them, I guess. I don't know. Like I'm not an expert on the PISA, but just looking at the last rankings, Finland is still up there, by the way, right? Still within the top 10 kind of country when it comes to that. Now, I'm also going to say this. I use it as a marker in a sense, right? As a highlighter, but I also don't think that the PISA is the end all be all of good quality education. So I'm a bit more nuanced here, but there's been a lot of discussion about Finland and what it's done because it is really different, and the outcomes are much different. Even if they're still not number one or whatever, there's a lot of positive going on here. So what has Finland done, especially in terms of cognitive engagement? Well, the first thing is their graduation rate is really high, right? It's sort of hovers around in the sort of lower 90s. Um, Part of the reason for that is because students get what I would call sort of an on-demand special education treatment. So they have the normal special education like we do, or you identify and test and sort of formally brought into a special education with an IEP. So they have that kind of structure too, but they also have something that's a bit more on demand. So if you're a student and you're struggling with something Monday, Tuesday, by the end of the week, you're getting very, very specific help because of the availability of teaching faculty. They can step in. There's a lot more flexibility. They can really support students in a much quicker fashion. That's a good thing, right? So you have this sort of on-demand special education, if you want to call it that. It's really just differentiation in a most positive way. The score they score, like I said, they score high fairly consistently high in the PISA, for whatever that's worth, right? One standardized test aimed at meaning and purpose. They have one standardized test before leaving secondary education, and that's kind of amazing, right? Because now you're not educating for the sake of some sort of standardized data. Um, at least that's when it occurs so infrequently. So that means you're actually educating in general for meaning and purpose, and even the test itself. I've seen some of the test items. This is not. This is more open-ended testing about real community-based issues and individual well-being. There's a lot more of that in the tests itself. So it's not just about do you know the parts of the cell, right? Give me a set of right answers, please, and we'll give you a percentage of your right answers, right, as a grade. It's a lot less of that, if it is that at all, actually, right? In elementary school, they have about 45 minutes of instruction followed by 15 minutes of recess. So 1/4 of their experience learning is focused on just free play, getting out, having a recovery period, which is awesome for the brain, right? That's and I read a book not too long ago. I can't remember the name, but of a teacher from the U.S. who moved to Finland and ended up teaching there, and at first really struggled with this notion because it's not like somebody is sort of mandating it, right? But it's more of the culture and the climate of common practice there. So at first he sort of said, I don't know if I can do this. This is a lot. It's a lot much. But eventually he moved to do it to doing that pattern 45 and 15 and saw that there was a real positive change in his students once he finally did that. So something to it, right? There's a culture of cooperation instead of competition, and that's huge because right now where we are, it's the culture of competition, right? You're seen as sort of weak if cooperation is more important, right? You have to struggle, compete, and fight your way and claw and all this kind of nonsense in our society, but that's what we do. They don't have any private schools, right? Everything is done through the public school system. So for them, that means that the public school system has to be high quality everywhere. There's not a structure of having schools and districts compete against one another. It's seen as a ridiculous notion and harmful. Um, so they're left with no other way of thinking other than to be responsible, which means be responsible for all districts and all schools. They have looping grades with their teachers in elementary schools, meaning that the teacher stays with them for 4 or 5 years at a time. Sounds like more of like 5 years, right? There's little to no homework, which I am deeply in favor of. I do not think that homework is a really good idea unless you're specifically working on something that you need a little more time with. I don't think homework has any place in learning. The poverty rate is about 5% in the country, compared to about 10% in the U.S. And that was in 2019 pre-COVID, right? There's a flourishing democracy there. Not that anything is perfect, and not that Finns would tell you that they think that their existence is perfect either. And then, how did they get there? Well, from the professional development standpoint and education, it took about 3 decades. There was this attempt to do something really meaningful, really engage with teachers. Teachers are treated as professionals within the community, within the country. They're seen as just as important as what the high status jobs are, like lawyers and doctors and all that. So there's a real cultural shift in terms of what it means to even be a teacher, and it's not a given. Just because you apply to a program and you have the grades, it doesn't even mean that you're going to get into it. You have to demonstrate a certain level of quality of character and so forth. Not in the sort of 1890s sense where all the social norms. it has to do more with sort of a responsibility mindset is what they're in a level of maturity kind of thing. Right? Are you ready to actually be a teacher as a human being? Right? So that's kind of where Finland is. So if we're thinking about how can we really improve cognitive engagement here in our communities, what is it that we need to do? So this question, what keeps my students from being cognitively engaged, is a seemingly better question because it's far more encompassing, right? Engagement and interest are connected to something very important within all of us, learning as a basis for thriving. When learning is reduced to just a long set of tasks that are connected to right and wrong answers, that's a very narrow view of what learning is or should be in our lives. Learning is is really quite important in the process of living. In fact, learning is very much connected to our ability to thrive. Right? It's not the only thing, but it's a really important one. So let's put that as the core of our ideas. If we're going to build out this sort of ideology of thinking, this hierarchy or this structuring, let's put learning as a basis for thriving right at the center and try to now reorganize our thinking around that. Right? So engagement, interest is an outcome of the conditions in which a student experiences learning. It's not a starting point. So we have to flip that in our mind, right? Engagement is something that it's not a starting point, it's an outcome. When all these conditions are present, engagement is something that is heightened, right? So it's an outcome. And it's not a switch that we can just simply flip within our students. So if we're walking around with that assumption in our head, we're also limiting ourselves, but we're also dehumanizing our students because that's not how things work. They're human beings. It's up to them, right? What we can do is a lot of really positive work with them, around them, creating that external environment of the classroom and school that's super positive, and connected to a larger community. And then the cognitive engagement sort of flows out of that, right? If it's a super stressed environment, then cognitive engagement is going to be highly compromised. So in both cases, cognitive engagement is an outcome. It's not a starting place. And it's certainly not something we can flip. If anything, it's really connected to the greater sort of external experience that's connecting to our inner experience. So if kids feel valued, they will learn what you're asking of them to learn. That's one approach here, right? And that's not something that sort of comes out or came out from the swamp of possibilities with the first question, right? Because the assumption was wrong and limited. If they feel like they are a burden to a teacher, they shut down, especially if they deal with chronic bad stress in their lives. Now, no student's going to do well, especially elementary, middle school, high school students. They're really not going to do well, or at least not as well as they could, if they feel like a burden, that the teacher treats them like they are a burden. And that is conveyed and communicated in so many different ways, right? Subtle and explicit. So now tack that on to them living in a potentially stressful community, because we have lots of those in this society. We're not a society that takes care of people. We're a society that kind of punches you in the face and says, you're on your own, right? Maybe that's a bit extreme, but in many cases, not really. So it is up to us to sort of look at that greater culture, and we have to address that context. Now, I talk about this in other videos, but what I'm doing here is I'm using a thriving theory as the base framework for thinking. And so I'm going to keep using this particular framing of thinking as the framework that I'm basically going to keep going back to make sure that I'm doing what I think that the intended outcomes are. So, what's the framework? The framework is that there's, in a thriving community, these are three major components and qualities that I think would be there. One, well being. Two, sustainability. Three, sort of the integration of those two things together. One, well being. So, at the very individual level, there's a strong sense of I'm more or less free to pursue my and grow into my best self. Okay, and that's encompassing a lot of things, right? But just generally speaking, I'm able to do that, and society is built in a way that's not just me who's able to do that, but many, if not all people, right, best version, are able to do that too. So there's a high level of collective well-being as well, right? If all individuals are able to do that, then collectively we're in good shape too with our well-being. Second, sustainability. So there's this integrative mindset of seeing how their internal sort of sustainability, if you want to call it that, or internal well-being, and the community and the external are affecting one another, right? Back and forth between the two. So the internal and the external, and then the external. If we look at that more closely, what we're talking about is the social, ecological levels of sustainability that are going on there, inclusive of things like social justice, equity, inclusion, but now in the context of aimed at thriving together, having thriving communities. Okay? And then the self also having lines there that are interconnected with that kind of relationship. And that's where the third one comes in, is to say that we're also critically, democratically literate, which is to say that we have a deep understanding of what it means to critically and democratically engage within our communities. It's a norm that we do so on a very regular basis. It's an expectation, and it's not just that the elected officials are the ones who make the decisions and we just harass them in either direction. It's that we actually are part of a body of decision making people, and we are, just like we get up and go to work now. Most days we would get up and spend at least a portion of the day being in that sort of democratic community and making decisions together. And that's exhausting, right? That's a lot of work. But in a thriving community, ideally, we would have a situation or some kind of setup where we can do that kind of work every single day. But we do have a say, and we work together to make that community happen together, right? So we're liberating ourselves from this greed ideology. We're moving towards an integrative, thriving ideology that requires us to be, as a community, requires us to be very involved and working together that way. So there's sort of a framework of things, and that's the framework that I've come up with. There's lots that people can add to it, take away, emphasize, de-emphasize, whatever, right? But this is just a framework that I'm working with right now, and I may adjust it down the road myself. What do I know, right? Anyway, as I start to think about it more, and as others think about it more, and provide their thoughts as well. Anyway, so let's try to extrapolate that, the framework. Let's try to extrapolate out of that what would be aspects of schooling that would connect to each one of the three parts of that framework. Okay, so that's what this graphic here is about. So you have the theory, the framework on the left. You have the what I'm using here in the middle actually is another framework of positive psychology has identified some very important things that tend to create happiness in our lives, right? At least the things that we have control over. And the first category there is autonomy and personal growth that's meaningful to us, growth that we can see on our own. The second one is meaningful contributions. So we can be part of the greater community and providing meaningful contributions in a very regular way. So it feels good to be able to provide. and contribute to society and feel like we're part of that. And the third is to have high quality relationships in general, right? Friendships, family, love, whatever. Loving intimacy, perhaps, right? All of that, sort of put all those three things together, and you find that there's a pretty strong core of what we tend to call happiness. Maybe a deeper sense of well-being is what we really mean by that. But anyway, if you take the thriving theory on the left and look at how happiness tends to be formed in deep ways in our lives, on the right you see where we as teachers and administrators have the ability to affect those things, how we can affect individual well-being, how we can affect sustainability, how we can affect the ways in which we create and live, hopefully live in these thriving communities. Wouldn't that be lovely? Okay, so you see on the right there, teacher-student relationship, right? The way in which we connect with our students, which is interesting because we have a lot. The way in which our relationship exists also has an impact on how our students can personally grow. School and classroom climate, and then in the middle one, the curriculum and instruction. There's a lot there that we can do that's connected to contributions, meaning and purpose, and if you look at high quality relationships, and I mean that more in the community sense, right? Not just in the individual teacher-student relationship sense, but in the greater community sense. We see schools' role in its community, curriculum and instruction. We can actually teach about these things. It can be embedded in various topics that we already teach. And then school and classroom climate itself. So there's ways in which we can do this kind of work in the context of school that connects to happiness and connects to the thriving, the creation of thriving theory, creation of thriving communities, right, using the framework there. And this is just a graphic that, sort of gives this sort of composite view. This art piece here by Jessica Pearlstein is amazing, and I use it constantly because it's just this really wonderful way to sort of envision what life can possibly be. So I talked about it a million times. Anyway, if this is your first time, please watch other videos. There's a lot more there. But the composite view here is that, if you take those three ways that happiness sort of grows within us, and you see the greater thriving community in the picture itself, then you sort of see where, just as I said before on the previous slide, where school has a place in connecting with those really important things. Anyway, so one of the things that we tend to do, as I said before, is we sort of get stuck in this question of what can we do tomorrow. And I get it. I really do. It's wonderful when we have something that we can take and put into our classroom tomorrow, and all is good, right? And of course there are things that we can do tomorrow, and I mentioned them before. Project-based learning, the way in which we engage and go up that Bloom's taxonomy. These are things that we've been talking about forever. So my question would be, since we have been talking about them for so long, why is if you're not doing those sort of things and you want to do those things, what are the things that are keeping you, what are the conditions that are keeping the teachers from doing that? What are the conditions that have been keeping administrators from supporting that? You get the idea, right? So what can we do tomorrow? There's been a lot of answers of what we can do tomorrow given over the years. So maybe there's something more to it than just that, right? So if you really want to break it down, you have some areas here that you can work with. The first one is this overall district-wide approach. So, first thing I have listed on here is avoid low-hanging fruit options for larger problems. Doesn't mean don't do the sort of small, gimmicky things that aren't, maybe they're not gimmicky, right? Maybe you use them in a meaningful way. But I think you get my point here, which is stop using those as answers for much larger problems that they just simply will never be able to solve, right? Develop district-wide process of identifying needs and appropriate responses and solutions, okay? So I think that that's something that there is, and I will put out um, quite a bit of videos on all of these. But that's one that happens, but it usually happens through a pretty limited mindset of what needs to be attended to. So more discussion on that. Second, use long-term deep change as the goal, but using some short-term low-hanging fruit can be intentional, dealing with an immediate need. So that's, in other words, this is sort of restating the first one. It's okay. If there's an immediate need that you want to get to right away, do it. Okay. Knowing full well that there's much bigger issues that have to be dealt with. All right. Second major category here: social emotional context. This is huge. And I talk about this in other videos, but basically it comes down to this. As students, I'm a student too, oftentimes, right? Um, we don't learn well when we're emotionally compromised. When we're losing our minds, we can't use our mind, right? So, students need to feel this kind of stability within the class. You can't control what goes on outside in the community. Whatever stresses they're experiencing there are real and need to be validated. And chronically stressed people are much quicker to have more extreme reactions than somebody who's not chronically stressed. Bad stress has a horrible impact on us in so many ways. So we need to provide a really emotionally stable place and understand that it's only when we're sort of emotionally stable that we can cognitively um, go to our optimal, places, right? So emotions and relations are really key. That is definitely something that you can work on tomorrow. But there's a long-term approach there too, which is to keep looking at that, meeting about that, having people observe your classrooms, not with the purpose of being evaluative and some sort of renewal process, but just it's good to have another set of eyes who are looking at things and seeing what's going on, and also being open to it. As I tell my students all the time, once you get into student teaching, if you're not receiving feedback, if you're not incorporating feedback, you're in the wrong profession, right? If that's something that your ego is too big, where you can't do that, you need to rethink if this is the right space for you. We as teachers always need to be able to receive positive, constructive feedback. I'm not talking about somebody making you feel like dirt, um, but positive, constructive feedback. And it's really helpful for other teachers, and maybe it's just teachers too. So it doesn't feel like it's such an evaluation, right? Dispense with competition framework. We got to get rid of that and replace with an integrative, thriving framework as a basis for creating, practicing, and growing. So look, we're very much in this competition framework. Chasing the dollar is based on competition. There's a job out there that I have to outcompete somebody for in order to get the job, in order to get the money. Kids know this. This is not the best way in which we continue to choose to live, but this is what we have for the moment. That being said, it's not something that has to be the driving factor or the driving feeling in schools. So moving to something that's more thriving. If we normalize thriving, if we normalize cooperation, if we normalize ways in which we can, deal with problems peacefully, that's pretty awesome as they become adults who then move into the world, and that's a mosaic that will change with them. Third category here: curriculum and instruction. The context in which curriculum and instruction occurs is something that we've got to pay attention to. We are not paying attention to it. We are just, in the flowing river, and we're not seeing the source of where all of this flow is coming from. So we need to reframe, basically change the flow. We need to reframe learning as open-ended, divergent, community-based, and integrative. We need to redesign curriculum and lessons towards meaning and purpose using critical constructivism and thriving pedagogy. And I'm going to go through all of that. are these things that you can start to work on tomorrow. There are small aspects of each one of these that you can, and then that just becomes part of the patterns, the profession, and the larger cultural and climate based experiences that we have. These are the most positive. They have the greatest impact. The effect size, if you want to go statistically here, is the greatest. There's a lot here that needs to be considered. Now, that being said, your school has its own collection of things that it's strong in and things that need improvement. Some schools have a lot more things that are on the improvement side, and some schools are doing well in many ways already. But most schools are sort of living in this competition mindset. Most schools are not thinking about, and I'm anthropomorphizing the schools here, right? But it's really the people inside the schools. Most teachers and most administrators, I think the desire is there to work in a thriving mindset, but we don't know quite how to do it, which is why the framework is really important. So use the framework to keep guiding you. Okay, so we're going to regroup some of so this sort of chaotic spitball list here on the left. We're going to regroup them into various categories. I'm going to go through each one of the categories. So first one, larger community stresses and climate. They tend to have chronic bad stress, continuous negative relationships, and anxiety. Right now, we're talking about the larger community itself, not just the school, but the community in which the school or schools within your district exist. Some, there's a lot, whether they're rural, urban, or suburban. There's a lot of communities that are very stressed. There's not a lot that a school can do about it directly, although they certainly can contribute to some sort of shift in a positive way. But we have to at least start by recognizing that our students may be coming from, a daily experience of not feeling great really almost any of the time. So it's a constant battle, it's a constant struggle, and we just have to understand that if if I haven't experienced that, then I probably need to be open to emotionally why kids are going through what they're going through, why they respond and react in the ways that they do, why they're interested in this but not so much interested in that. If you've never had to experience that in your life, you probably really need to keep in check the things that you're putting out there, the way in which you're conveying meaning, purpose, and what's right and wrong, all of that, right? Because you may not understand that if you live in chronic poverty, or if you're chronically worried about where the next dollar is coming from, or you have to rely on government subsidies in order to survive, that is super stressful. It feels like failure. It feels like a lot of really negative things. And to get by, some people choose very extreme options, right? So there's not a lot of positive there. It's basically, one bad experience to choose from another bad experience, right? There's not like really high quality positive things that come your way very often. Anyway, so some key questions here. You can read through them on your own. I'm going to go through things a bit more categorically here, but these might be some questions, and please look through them. There might be some questions there that are really important for your school, your district, and your classroom. So there's a video here. I've sort of cut up this particular TED Talk from Jeffrey Duncan Andrade, and he's done some really good work in the San Francisco area, actually Oakland, my apologies, in the Oakland area with his kids. So, and he's, I think he's on point for the way in which you should support kids and families and help them. So, pause, go to the slideshow itself. The link to the slideshow is also in the description on YouTube there. Um, please make sure you do that. It's really important to see in real terms the kind of work that he's doing. So I'm going to continue, of course, but pause, go and watch this portion of the video. Okay? So how does the type of town or neighborhood impact engagement, cognitive engagement, right? And the type of town or the neighborhood is often a proxy for race and class within our society, right? So let's go through the different levels of wealth and how they impact cognitive engagement. Working class poor is the first category. Cognitive engagement is highly compromised by the larger context of stress caused by financial struggle and survival. I was starting to get into this before, but if you feel, just as a human being, this is true for everybody, right? If you feel a constant, day-to-day, relentless stress on you, it's really hard to cognitively engage in something that's also going to have a certain level of stress to it. You're just, at the very least, you're just worn out, right? And that's sort of putting it nicely, right? We have a society where people, if you're so unlucky to be born into a target group where you're going to be more chronically stressed because our society is organized that way, you're also going to be blamed for all the things that you do or don't do, right? It's really hard to shoulder all of that on a regular basis, right? There's a living in constant fear of not having enough money that takes priority of over all things in life. There's very few good opportunities that are available, if at all, making it so that there is a more continuous dealing with additional challenges and unpredictability around them. So, we've gone through, we're still going through this pandemic right now, which meant that a lot of kids had to stay home, especially 2020, right? We basically took March through June, not off, but we took it into remote learning. And for a lot of kids, that was an impossibility to do that. And it was predominantly within the working class poor. And that's not to say that there's not this care about learning. It's just they're getting hit even harder by that, right? We all got hit hard, but they got hit the hardest. And so where's the opportunity there? If you can't afford Wi-Fi, well then you're just stuck to a cell phone at best, right? So we as a society did not take care of our working class poor. We did not take care of our working class poor kids who needed our assistance in a big way. We just sort of left them hanging. And, that sucked. That really sucked. And we're still in this space now. We haven't really done much to correct that. We've gotten some technologies out to people, but, and it's not like it's widely available for free Wi-Fi and all this. So just the technological accessibility itself is something that was completely mishandled and continues to be a struggle today, right? Not to mention all the other things about what happens with jobs and who can go to work and who can't, who's staying with the kids, who's not. It's endless. So it's chaotic, it's stressful, every day is as intense as the last one. And if you do in that level of intensity, how do you get out of this? Well, somewhat recent studies showed that it took about 20 years of doing everything right in order to significantly move out of poverty. No mistakes, right? That's superhuman in my mind. I don't know how many people could really endure that and make that move as successfully. I don't think I would be able to do that if I was living in that kind of condition. So lives are inevitably chaotic because of constantly living on the financial edge of complete disaster. As I said before, technology is reduced to a cell phone in most cases, and working class poor get chastised really for any decision that they make that does not align with the perceptions of higher economic classes. That one is critical for teachers to understand because teachers generally are not working class poor people. Um, some may have come from working class poor experiences, but they're generally not there anymore. Even though we don't make like a ton of money, we're you know surviving, I guess, right? Uh, Generally speaking. So it's easy to judge and misjudge and chastise parents and kids for, whatever they do that you don't think is the best move. And that happens all the time. Parents get blamed all the time. Whenever I teach classes, it's a regular topic that comes up all the time, and that kind of talk really needs to stop because all it's showing is just a complete misunderstanding of what parents and kids are dealing with on a very, very, very regular basis that we're just not seeing. And then there's this sort of perseverating feeling of constantly being wrong or a failure in others' eyes, right? That has to, that feeling is there, and the best thing you can do with that is just try to ignore it, but it's always there. Now, if we go to the middle class, the cognitive engagement tends to be fueled by two simultaneous beliefs. A belief in meritocracy. So if you work hard enough, you'll see the rewards of working hard enough. And that upward economic mobility is possible. Now, neither of these are probable in this society. It tends to be around 80% of people who are, whatever the class they're born into, stay in for most, if not all, of their life. So there is a 20% movement here, which is not to say that it's nothing, but it's not everything. So the probability is working against us. Is there a possibility? There's a possibility, but not as much as we would like, I think. There's milder levels of worrying about finances. Doesn't mean that the middle class doesn't have it, because they certainly do. But it tends not to be as chronically intense, and it tends to be connected to things like layoffs, which are sudden and unexpected in the business world. This happens. You could be working on Thursday and be laid off on Friday, and that's it. That's hard. It's hard to live that way, right? And so there's going to be other things too. The lives are a little less chaotic because when money is more consistent. But there's, moving from town to town because of a job. There's a job change. Maybe there's divorce, job loss, and so forth. So, and then, a lot of times people need to go back to school and get a higher educational degree. That's something that takes away from time at home. So, if you're a parent, you can't really spend as much time with your kids anymore. Or you do that, but now you're losing sleep because you're doing it during the time that they're sleeping. I mean, right? So it's endless. Again, it's not the same intensity of problems that working class poor deal with, but they're there. Technologically, in terms of what's available, okay. So there tends to be this situation in the middle class where if somebody doesn't have a laptop, they will get one eventually, but they have to do some saving up or put it on the credit card. So it's not just for a lot of folks in the middle class. It's not that they can just snap a finger and go out and buy one, and it doesn't really have a financial impact on them. It tends to, because it's a pretty significant expense. I mean, you're still talking about at least $600 for somewhat reasonable laptop that's not freezing up or having technological issues and what have you, right? Do they have access to it? Sure. Do they have Wi-Fi at home? They tend to, right? So there's money to do that, but it also is, they're still sort of eking out maybe some level of stability here, right? But it's there. The possibility is there, I mean. The middle class is often treated as sort of the hero class of society because, they've made it, right? They're a kind of worker that's not high up. They're sort of in the middle, and they're doing a lot of the important work generally. Working class are very working class poor are looked down upon because they're doing the grunt work, right? The work that nobody wants to do, and it's sort of seen as lowbrow and doesn't require a lot of skill and blah blah blah, right? So even though they're doing working class poor are doing really important work for us, it's not seen with a great amount of respect. Middle class work tends to be seen with respect because they're doing the kind of work that tends to require some kind of training or education to get there, and they're basically the ones who are making the super wealthy, right? So there tends to be this sort of positive characterizing of middle class workers and middle class families and middle class in our society, right? But we have also seen the shrinking of the middle class with the tendency of people dropping out towards poverty, not moving up towards affluence. So there's very little of that. It's not zero, but it's very little. But when there's when there's change in the middle class, it tends to be more on the downward side. And last but not least, the middle class is up to their eyeballs in debt, because to live a middle class lifestyle, you have mortgage, you have car loans, you have credit cards. There's a long list of things. You might have to consolidate some loans to get by for a while. You're doing some significant juggling of money. Something breaks in the home, now you got to pay for that if you own it. There's things that happen where you just have headaches. You have times where you can sort of breathe, and you have times where there's headaches. Now, the reason why I say all of that for the middle class is because what tends to happen is that kids have less emotional stress to deal with. And not that they're free from it, because I give a lot of examples here, but they have less, and so when you have less emotional stress, you have more cognitive availability that you can work with, right? So the real compromising factor here, in a very direct way, tends to be the emotional stress component, right? Now, the other compromising factor, of course, is the level of just outright injustice in the way in which our society preys upon people in the various groups. When we get to the wealthier groups, the upper middle class and the affluence, here's what we tend to see, right? This is, in towns that have household median incomes of $200,000 and more. That's the kind of town that I'm talking about here. What do we tend to see? Well, we see that kids cognitively engage probably the most in terms of percentage-wise. But there's this funky thing going on here too. So let me speak really generally here for a moment. The upper middle class and affluent groups are generally really concerned and focused on trying to maintain that level, right? So in our society, we tend to think positively of them. We tend to think of like that's our target. That's where we all like to be. But folks in those categories are really trying to maintain that status. So why do we see more sort of parents taking a heavy-handed approach in terms of what the school is saying and what they think their kids should have, and pushing back on teachers and pushing back on administrators and all this? Because the driving fear tends to be that some of these things, let me put it this way. If a parent in this group feels that the school is doing something that might have a long-term effect on the kid's ability to maintain this socioeconomic status as an adult, there's a threat there. That's when parents especially push back. And it can be the minorest of threats, right? It can be that a kid normally gets A minuses and maybe B pluses, now got a C on something. Well, they're freaking out because are they going to be able to get into Dartmouth, right? There's a real ongoing anxiety and fear with finances and sort of keeping the status that they have. So whereas working class poor and middle class are struggling just to have enough money to get by, right? Working class poor are suffering immensely. Middle class is more or less getting by, but getting hit with hot water heaters and refrigerators and things like that, that make for some stress. You're going from having a chronic level of stress to intermittent kind of stressors, right? Here, anybody who is not in this category would look at the category and say, "What are you worried about? You are chronically fine. What is the issue? What are you fearing? What's the anxiety for?" And the anxiety is losing that status, losing that position, because they know that sometimes those job positions go, right, or that the kid especially isn't taking things seriously enough so that they too can have that level of lifestyle as they grow up. So there's this real anxiety that is now transferred onto the kid, and transferred especially or aimed at teachers and administrators. And so teachers and administrators walk on eggshells constantly, trying to make sure that upper middle class and affluent parents are not down their throats, or they're always, teachers and administrators are constantly calculating the words that they're using to communicate anything to this community, because of the way in which they're just simply going to push back, because everything is seen as a possible threat. So the anxiety level is high. They have money, but the anxiety level is high, right? So they tend to live a less chaotic life because the money is there, right? Now, there's certain things that still happen, right? Just like the middle class, you have divorces and job changes and job loss and moving and additional higher education requirements. Those things are still there, and can certainly be a source of stress. But the money, the loss of money, isn't really an ongoing. It's never really an ongoing issue, except for the general anxiety of losing the whole status itself, right? So, what this means though is, because parents are so heavily involved and so many hours of the week are connected to their jobs that require them to be connected all of the time, um, that means that you're also disconnected from your kids. So there's a real suffering going on there with kids who are constantly feeling neglected by their parents, but don't really know that things could be different, right? But there's just a sense of loss there. And parents who also feel that way too, because their stress levels are really high doing their job. So the stress has now moved from, do we have money? Are we ever going to have money? To, I have a lot of stress to do this job that affords us this socioeconomic status. And now I have to really give up my life, right, with occasional, vacations here and there, and holidays. And my kids don't get to see me as much. And I'm super stressed, and they're thinking less of me as time goes on. And that's making me feel bad, all this sort of stuff. And then somebody does something to get attention in a negative way, and now we blow up and have those kind of experiences. And nobody seems to understand where it all comes from, right? And because that there's also in this group, there tends to be, and I think there's variation here too. People will say, "Oh, I don't do that," but there tends to be this feeling of, I have to demonstrate that I've made it. I have to demonstrate. I have to sort of put on display that I've made it. One of those things, not just the cars and the houses, but one of those things is the technology. So kids in this group tend to get technology handed to them at very early rates, whether it's iPads or if it's phones or laptops or whatever, and the requirement for them to have them starts much lower in life too. So it's also sort of like this display of, like, I have the newest iPhone, aren't I awesome? And I don't have an iPhone. This is a LG, just much cheaper, very functional. Anyway, but this is part of it. So when the transition happened to remote learning, for instance, it shouldn't be any surprise that upper middle class kids were able to make that adjustment much more so than really everybody else, because they already had the technology in their house. It was already there, right? There wasn't In terms of technology, there was no adjustment that had to be made in terms of getting the hardware itself, right? That was already there for the most part. Um, Now, as I said before, this second to last bullet here, upper middle class and affluent classes are treated as a target outcome, right? It's the preferred space that everybody would love to get to. We all would love to have a household, median incomes of $200,000 or more. Why would we not want that sort of thing? That's what we're aiming for. That's sort of the American dream right there in a number. But this lifestyle also has this ratcheting up effect. The debt now is higher because you've doubled the price of the house that you just bought. You've doubled the price of the car that you just bought, right? You've your credit cards now, because of your income and because of your ability to pay for loans, credit scores go up. So credit card have higher maxes and so forth. And so it is easy to sort of get into this place of being really overwhelmed with money and expenses too. So anyway, if you take all three of them and look at them, right, working class poor, middle class, and upper middle class affluence, if you look at how and why the parents are involved, not involved, whatever, it has a lot to do with the stresses that they deal with on a very daily basis, right? If you're working class poor, you're chronically stressed and don't really ever feel like you have the ability to just breathe and you don't have to fight the fight today. No, you have to fight the fight all the time. You need somebody to fight the fight with you because you can't do it on your own, right? It's horrible. So cognitive engagement is compromised. Parents are just not as involved at schools, but it's not because they don't want to be. It's because they can't. Life is chaotic. Life is extremely difficult, and school, unfortunately, tends to be one of those things that doesn't keep the high priority. What working class poor parents generally want is for the school to work and function on its own and do good stuff for their kids. As long as it's happening, it's good, right? It doesn't mean that they have to be there every 5 minutes checking in on their kid. It just means that there's adults there, they know what they're doing a good job. I can see progress with my kid, great. Because I have so many other things that I have to worry about. I'm glad this is happening, and I will happily check in, but I can't do everything because I have 50,000 other things on my mind right now. Glad my kid is learning math, reading, science, and seems to be progressing. Maybe they're not perfect, but they're still progressing. Yay, right? Like, not perfect, but okay. One less thing out of 50,000 for me to worry about. It doesn't mean that they don't want to be more part of it. It just means they can't. All right. Middle class parents tend to be generally supportive of schools, but in a similar sense, as long as the school is, more or less doing its job, they tend to be fairly hands off, right? Involved, but fairly hands off. Not putting a ton of pressure on admins and teachers to, here and there for sure. But there tends to be more of that sort of like, okay, things are going well. Glad the school is communicating with me. They have an event, we go. My kids are in choir, we go and see that. Whatever, right? So that tends to be parent involvement there because the stress levels are down. They can deal with life, but they still have responsibilities that keep them occupied. They still have some worry about money, but it's seemingly somewhat manageable, unless things really fall apart. And then, because of that level being so much lower, the cognitive engagement for kids tends to be a bit higher, right? And more consistent and more stable. And it tends to be more genuine in a sense, right? Kids are asking questions of interest for themselves, and there tends to be more of that going on. They're not depleted emotionally. They're not exhausted by life. They're able to come in and do school. If it's hard, they can kind of take it on. For the most part, they're not totally checking out of school. For the most part, they're sort of staying with it, seeing that graduation is important, going to college and all that. Upper middle class parents, as I said before, are very involved because of that intense anxiety of their kid missing out on that socioeconomic status later on in life. So they are very hands-on, sort of collectively as a group, right? Not, there's, again, individual variation, but collectively as a group. And there's sort of this conspicuous involvement. I mean, we make TV shows about this sometimes, right? The soccer moms and all that. It's like we have to sort of perform in front of one another how involved we are with our kids in school, because that's some sort of way of communicating, power or whatever weirdo thing that they've been trained to sort of think about as important in life. It's a little less genuine and a little more performative. Doesn't mean that they still don't care about their kids. Of course, they care about their kids, but they're so amped up about trying to like save their kingdom, make sure the kingdom is maintained for the next generation. That tends to really drive the feelings and the practices and the anxieties, and there's a sort of fakeness there, right? All the things that need to be really dealt with. It's hard. What can I say, right? 60, 80 hours a week. Somebody's out of the house, constantly on the phone, trying to. It's a marathon, a constant marathon of trying to maintain that lifestyle. So they're stressed for different reasons, but that's what you're dealing with, and that's what you're seeing, right? It's trying to maintain all of that. Now, cognitive engagement for kids tends to be up, but it's fueled more by parental pressures. It's fueled more by these sort of expectations that you're going to become a lawyer, you're going to become a doctor, you're going to become upper management, right? You're going to be some sort of STEMmy person who's making $150,000, $200,000 a year. So that's the pressure that kids are feeling oftentimes, whether it's explicit or if they're just sort of seeing it in their life and they feel like that's the expectation that they have for themselves too. So the cognitive engagement is up, but it's not always up for the right reasons. And it can be exhausting, sort of dealing with all of that, right? Now, you got to sort of pick and choose. Where are we at? What's our community look like? What's the effect on community engagement and so forth? So larger community stresses, the sort of three big ones here: chronic bad stress, and as you heard, chronic bad stress can exist in the upper middle class and affluence as well, right? It's not just the middle class poor folks who have that intensity of it. There's a different version of it in upper middle class and affluent groups too. And it comes in different forms, right? Different dynamics. So the larger community can have chronic bad stress. The larger community can have continuous negative relationships with what's going on there. And again, taking different forms. Some of it might be crime oriented, for instance, but some of it might just be this underlying hostility that's driven by competition all the time. You get that sort of sense, right? And then there's a high continuous anxiety and instability. So in all three cases, if we were going from a very unsustainable, unthriving, if you will, to a thriving, you have these options here that are or conditions maybe conditions is a better word here, conditions that exist within thriving community. So in a thriving community, you would have growth-oriented good stress. You would have continuous supportive caring relationships, and you have strong sense of reliability and stability. So I've put here on slides sort of the various ways in which these pop out, the ways in which we can see all of those happening. There's a lot of stuff on here. So let me sort of just highlight it and run through it, right? In the growth-oriented good stress area, I've talked about this a lot already, but let me sort of point out one of them that I haven't quite gotten to yet. We can explicitly teach about stress. That's the second one down. And we can have a lot more flexibility with our academic demands and deadlines. And we can certainly, I think this one would be a big one. We can use what I'm calling, or at least conceptualizing in my head, as accomplishment inventories. So in the medical field, you have these sort of SOAP notes, right? Where you take these subjective, objective, assessments of people to see kind of where they're at and to get a sense as to where their health is and where it might be going, right? You have some sort of prognosis, diagnosis kind of relationship going on there, right? In the educational world, we have elements of that going on, but we don't always draw attention to them in very formal, explicit ways. We could do our own version of sort of teacher SOAP notes, which would mean that we can, sort of keep track of what were the successes and what were the struggles that really popped out for a kid. And you kind of just go to, now if you have 20 kids in a classroom, you cannot do this every single day. But as something occurs that seems kind of significant in either direction, that's something that we can just sort of keep, right? So at the end of the day, you can be like, huh, what's going on with this kid, right? And then you have this what I would consider to be actually meaningful data. It would be subjective, but at least there's a sort of record. Like 2 weeks ago, this thing happened, and 2 weeks prior to that, there was a death in the family and so forth. So you can sort of see where the arc is for the kid, right? And I think that would be really powerful. And we kind of catalog those thoughts in our head, but we have so many other things going on as a teacher. It's really hard to just keep that in our head. One more thing to do, perhaps, right? Oh my God. But it's something that I think, even if you did, a couple of kids a day when something happened, I think that would be a really helpful way of keeping track of what's going on with kids, right? Using humor is huge, and that's not done enough in the classroom. It's done, but it's certainly not done enough because we put so much seriousness around our content areas, or we have to do this for test scores. Let's just, we're going to clap our hands and make you feel good until you get the test scores up and all this kind of stuff, right? But it really draws away from the humanity of people. It draws us into this really dehumanized space, our feelings, and humor can do a lot of heavy lifting to get us, back to feeling whole again. The continuous supportive, caring relationships. I mean, of course, right? And again, highlights. Discuss dreams and goals regularly. I think that's huge. Again, something that I don't think we do a lot of. We do it on occasion, but if you know kids' dreams, if you know their and the goals of how they're thinking of getting there, there's so much that you can have them do academically and pedagogically that's connected to their actual dreams and their actual goals, right? Because something within them is saying this is really important to them. Now, um, having taught in a town, I think there's other dynamics to consider here. So having taught in a town, I taught in Hartford, and saw very pervasively how being super stressed really affects the dreams and the goals part too, right? The way in which people deal with that is to look for more of an extreme escape from it, right? That that's how bad things are, that you have to think about being playing for the NFL or being a successful rapper, that kind of stuff that comes out of kids' mouths all the time, and you cannot blame them because the options are so few that kids are constantly turning their attention to people who look like them, who have similar backgrounds, and this is how they've made it. So that's rough. When that is your only real sense of where success might be available for you. So I think that's going to pop up a lot, and so when that's a different dynamic to deal with when we're talking about dreams and goals in the classroom. But I think it's still something that should be put out there, and people should be able to put that up on the wall, right? And make references to it and see how their work can go in that direction, right? Goals and dreams might change over time, and maybe the classroom space is something that gives them more hope too. Anyway, maybe not. Maybe it also limits it depending on how we're teaching things. But here we also want to do is focus on positive contributions and reminding kids, especially when they're struggling, reminding kids of what their accomplishments have been so far. That they're doing great, right? Like the fact that you're even still trying is amazing. I'm glad you got 2 out of the 18 right. So let's move around. Let's keep going. Let's keep doing this, right? How do you get 3 and 4 right? How do you get 10 right? Anyway, remind them of the accomplishments so they feel that it's not that they're doing all bad, right? And also remind them, or not just remind them, but formally structure teaching pedagogically that is aimed at kids being able to do positive contributions to their communities. Community engagement is powerful. It makes you feel like you really are a part of something. And that inkling of hope that comes out of it can be something that drives somebody for years. That being said, there's plenty of kids who might look at that deeply skeptically as well. And again, rightfully so. Why would you not? When you see so many failures of a society, it's hard to really think that there's hope in that too. So you might have to work with that tension, but talk about and go from small to bigger. Talk about the classroom space itself. What can we contribute to this community right here, this community that we all have control over right now? And then the third one, strong sense of reliability and stability. Uh, that's incredibly important because while things are going on, because we're still talking about the larger community itself, when the community has significant instabilities within it, that classroom space needs to have stability within it. So you can see the list there, but basically it means that the teacher and the adults in the rooms and adults in the buildings need to be a source of genuine stability, right? It can't just be this sort of fake facade performative thing that we do in front of kids. It really needs to be genuine. That I got you. Yep. This was another challenge that we just went through, or you're going through right now. But I got you. You can do this. All right, what can we do after let's have a bit of recovery, but what can we do now, right? Or what can we do as soon as recovery seems like there's been enough of it? What do we do next? And I'll also say this too. You see there, so the fourth one down. Showing understanding. Sorry, let me do the third one now. Validate and show understanding. It's hard to be human, and there's plenty of times when we're compromised and we don't always do the best thing. So validate that, right? Let kids know that we're all human. We understand the way in which things played out for them for that moment too. Not that we want to keep doing that, maybe, right? Maybe it's not the greatest thing that just happened. But listen, I get it. You were feeling this way and you did this as what can we do next? Those feelings are real. What can we do next? Do we need to work on the intensity of those feelings? Do we need to work on taking time? Whatever. Okay. But the fourth thing is just what I was doing is, sort of clean. When do you clean the gutters of a house, right? And for those of you that haven't had a house, maybe you don't know this, right? But the gutters get filled with leaves and just, start decomposing and clogging up, and, that causes other problems. When do you clean the gutters? Well, you don't do it when the storm is happening. You do it during a sunny day. The point there, metaphorically, is when is it best to work with kids on something that they're struggling with? When they're actually not struggling with it in the moment, right? So help them in the moment for what they're going through, but really thinking through the problem is not something you can do when your mind is just completely filled with stress and emotion. When you do that is when things are calmer, right? When you have the ability to sit and calmly talk about something and really think something through. That's the best time to talk about long-term change. And maybe, because it might feel stressful for somebody to be talking to you saying, have you thought about this thing about yourself? Well, that's vulnerable, right? That's hard to hear. It's hard to receive. You don't want to do that when you're already amped up about whatever's going on in the moment. Okay. Now, moving into school's role in the community, it's interesting, right? A lot of these things sort of play out similarly as we go from layer to layer, right? But this is different in the sense of we're not talking about what's going on in the larger community anymore. Now we're talking about what the school's role in that community is, because that can also be seen from the outside in. It can be seen as a negative place. It could be seen as something that's disconnected from community or running against community or whatever, right? And if those elements are there, maybe they're not. Maybe your school's doing fine. But if those elements are there, that's also going to have an impact on cognitive engagement. So you see the sort of the list there. School can make people in the community feel devalued, dehumanized. schools can have a continuous negative relationship. Maybe they're not even intending to do that, but they are. And the school climate can be, uncaring, negative, hostile. The content lacks relevance. These are issues that can sort of collectively play out and characterize school within the community. And you see the questions there, right? Questions for consideration. Now, again, here's another part of that video. Pause my video, go over to the slideshow, and watch that. Do nothing. So, the role of the school in a more, like, if the role is going to be adding to thriving in a community, role of a school in a more thriving community, that school is everything that happens in the classroom is sort of home base for really everything, right? If the classroom space is a really positive, thriving place, um, all the other problems, whatever the school might have in terms of problems, all of those problems are generally seen as secondary. Generally, right? There's probably exceptions. Um, so that classroom space is really something that has to be attended to. It is not just the responsibility of the teacher in that classroom to make that space thriving. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Oh, it's a student's responsibility too. Yes, but you have a lot of support staff, and there needs to be more colleague to colleague support, right? We have not structured schools yet really well in a way where the adult who's the main teacher in the classroom gets a lot of other supports on a very regular basis. Um, they might say, okay, what about this content area coach and reading interventionist and all that? Those are helpful, but they're not helpful in the way that I am. They're helpful, but they're not helpful in the way that I'm talking about this. As a teacher in a classroom, I have to keep track of 50,000 things all at once. And, we eventually kind of get used to that, but we don't often really know the kind of impact that we're having and the kind of climate that we're creating and blah, 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 blah. It's extremely helpful to have other teachers, other, professional development done in a way where we're having adults supporting adults, right? I would say, and it's unfortunate because administrators have their hands full, 100 hours a day. But the best role that any administrator can have is being a support and really helping, like at the master teacher level, really helping somebody create that more thriving classroom, because every teacher on the planet has gotten burned out. Every teacher on the planet has had those days where you just go, oh my God, way too much. And then we all have our different ways of dealing with that feeling, right? So there needs to be somewhat of a restructuring where administrators are not just taking care of the budgets and the phone calls and the running of the show. There's got to be a way that somebody is really dedicated, maybe somebodies are dedicated to being that buddy in the classroom. It's not evaluative. It's really just being that kind of support to help a teacher manage and think through some of the things. So they're not on their own all the time, which is how most teachers generally feel, is that they're on their own. There's a plus to that. Sometimes we would just want to be alone and try something out, but there are definitely times where it would be really nice to have a professional support to just help think about something more. So there's that. That being said, schools are an important experience in becoming a person who is their best self and provides high quality contributions to community. There's pre-K really through college or post secondary experiences. If we really pay attention to that long-term arc, the long-term arc should be pointing towards something very generally that's here. Schools should be involved and supportive in helping people, you know, grow into their best selves as best self as they can, so that they can contribute at the highest levels that they can towards making this community thrive. A thriving community is dependent upon people being able to contribute at high levels. Another video, again, please pause and go through it.
Now,
all right, so the effect of a school's relationship with a community or a school's role in a community on cognitive engagement. So you can sort of read through from left to right here. Some of the problems are going to pop up again, and some of the ways in which we can do this are going to pop up in very similar ways, which is great, right? You mean I can deal with multiple problems at once just by bringing this one or two things into the classroom? Yes, right? So, looking at continuous support, caring relationships, it's really the same list that we saw before. So if you're doing those kind of things, it's going to also help in terms of the school's relationship with the community. So you have larger community, and you have then the school's relationship with that community. Both of those things are going to be attended to by providing this, list of continuous supportive caring relationships. Now the other part is the content piece. The way in which we do curriculum and instruction, right, the content itself as well as the pedagogy, but the content should also be doing some really important things. Community-based content, community-based learning, community-based is so lacking in our profession right now. And it's harder. No Prentice Hall can't print it out for us, and just do packaged programs. It doesn't work that way. So it does take time for us as professionals to come together and figure out how we can do that work. And it might take multiple years, and that's okay. But committing to that means that we're committing to helping this community become a more thriving community. One with less anxiety, one with less problems, one with less difficulties, which means people can cognitively engage more. So these are long term, and you see the list there, and none of them are just right off the bat, do them tomorrow, right? So you can, and I'm going to spend time, some other video really going through how to do this at a curriculum instruction level. But at the community level, I think one of the pieces there, I'm just looking over the list right now, one of the pieces there, you can read through it, but is the second to last one, which is that the way in which schools host community events is got to be something that's actually connected to the community, not just kids are displaying their work, but the work that the kids are doing, if the content itself is organized in such a community-based way, now when you have the community events, it's actually pertaining to the community, not just, my kids accomplished X, Y, Z, look at all the right answers that they got, right? So you get the idea here, right? I hope. Doing that kind of work is something that requires a great deal of thinking through and taking steps and PLCs, and we can't just, again, snap our fingers and do it, but something that very much needs to be considered. All right, student well-being. So now we're really starting to get into the individual kid. And this is a big topic, as you well know. And we've done a lot with social emotional learning and trauma informed and all that. Let me go through some of this here, right? The reason why I'm bringing this topic up here is because if you're not attending the student well-being, you're not attending to cognitive engagement. So this may be a part where maybe your school does need more work, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're doing pretty well in this, okay? But I will certainly talk through here. You can see the list of bullet points. Again, a lot of similarities with some of the past categories. And then some of your key questions that you may want to ask with your colleagues. So here's what I'm doing. I'm actually putting together student individual well-being and the classroom and school climate. A lot of that is so similar in terms of what we can actually do. They're different, different difficulties or problems to work with, and different dynamics for sure. But the similarities are so close to one another that, you know, I'm just going to put them both together and talk about them at the same time. So, classroom climate as well as student well being. They're not the same thing, but the way in which we deal with both of those or support both of those are very similar. And also in that mix is the third thing, which is this teacher's relationship with the students. Okay, so that should all be somewhat obvious, I think, right? Student well being as connected to classroom climate, as connected to the teacher's relationships with them. So, external well being affects internal well being. Classroom climate, school climate, teachers' relationships, and then student individual internal well being. Okay? Again, take a look at this video and we'll come back. Okay? So, what Jeffrey Duncan Andre talks about there, I think, is one of the most illuminating points, which is that stress is a huge factor. And when you come at schooling with that stress perspective in mind, you can do a lot more positive supports and see a lot more positive outcomes, which is huge for what he's doing there. And you're seeing that coming through in the various sections of the videos. Okay, so emotional stability is needed for optimal cognitive engagement. All right, so as I've said before, when the chronic stresses are there, the chronic stress, whether it's community, whether it's just an ongoing sense of failure, whatever it is, when it's chronic, we don't have bad stress is chronic stress. Chronic means that it doesn't go away, it's relentless. You never get that sense of feeling like you've really accomplished anything to change it. There's not a recovery period. So, good stress is when we are challenged by something and then we feel a sense of accomplishment. We've done something to accomplish whatever the challenge was. There's a recovery period, and then we're able to go and do that process or that cycle again. Bad stress doesn't allow for that. It never really feels like it ends, and it just makes you feel worse and worse and worse over time to the point where you probably just cope with it by ignoring it because you just can't keep looking at it anymore. So, what do we need? What we actually need is what I said before. We need good challenges. We need to see students need to see themselves accomplishing something. And if they're not able to do that, that's when even the good stresses get piled into the bad stresses. Okay? So what we're seeing right now, and I think I said this in another video as well, is because of Common Core, math and reading abilities or skills, we're all pushed down by at least a grade. So I learned multiplication and division in 4th grade. My kids are learning multiplication and division in 3rd grade. Now, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that's the important part here is, I was seen as a talented and gifted kid for my time. I don't know if I would be seen as talented and gifted in their time, right? My kids are pretty continuously stressed out by school. They're being asked a lot more questions that they can't answer on their own. So they're not feeling that sense of accomplishment. And their schooling, which is supposed to be good stress, is now becoming a source of bad stress for them, right? There's enough accomplishment where they can kind of, eke their way back out of that bad stress feeling, but it's so much less than what I experienced. I felt like I had some pretty decent self-efficacy as a kid in elementary school. My kids, not so much. None of them really feel like they're doing great at school. My kids, you can see that sort of underlying anxiety, right? You have to now, today, to be really talented and gifted at school, you really need to be like 2 grade levels above where you're at, right? And that's just a genetic thing at that point, right? There's nothing that you can really do to get at that level. Um, so, where are we going with this? Is my question. Um, because I don't think what's happening right now is actually ethical with what we're asking kids to be able to do at their ages. And the fact that we see kids being able to do it at those ages is not a good enough indicator because many kids are struggling. And that's on us, right? We're the adults, we're the ones who are supposed to be making really thoughtful, healthy decisions for the kids in the school, and we're not protecting them. What we're doing is we're stressing them out. So the good stresses are now turning more and more over to the bad stresses. And what I'm seeing at the college level is just anxiety, anxiety, anxiety. And that means that, my students who are now, at least 18 years old to 22, that group, so the non traditional older students who tend to actually have less anxiety about their work, they ask more questions and whatever, right? But the anxiety that's just sort of free flowing is really constant among kids who are sort of the Common Core kids, the No Child Left Behind kids, the kids who have been tested to the point of near cognitive extinction. Yeah, it's not good. It's really, really not good. So that's important to understand because we need to, as a profession, get that under wraps, I think. Right? So, what can you do? Well, you can pause, you can take some time, you can regroup when the emotions feel a bit more calm. You can figure out what is causing the flare up. The important thing here is also to validate what the child is feeling. It is normal to feel angry about this, frustrated about this, sad about this. Yeah, of course. I see where you're coming from. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so then, what do we need, right? And you can't just jump into that right away when the emotions are really intense. Trying to solve the problem is not always what's needed at that moment. In fact, it might make things worse. But sometimes it makes people feel a little better. But they have to be able to see that that solution actually works. Because if it doesn't work, it's just adding to more stress. Or at least that's the perception. If it's not going to work, it's going to add more stress. All right, be there for them. It's another form of validation in a way. Really resist the punishing. I can talk about experiences as a teacher or being somebody's student teacher advisor. Um, there's there are many times when a kid flips out but then does the right thing, even though they flipped out. Really focus on the way in which they tried to make the right decision, even though they were feeling really intense emotions. And resist punishing because that's not going to be really helpful. And then encourage another attempt when things have seemed to be have seemed to be calm at that point, right? Okay. What about cognitive approaches? So the first one was emotional approaches, the things that we can do, and then cognitive approaches. If the task is causing significant stress that seems to be adding to a continuous frustration, muscling through it will not work, right? It will harm. So, cognitively, it's going to have to follow what's going on emotionally. And that's really the point here. So, return to what students do understand. Let them see that they have succeeded before. Provide reassurance that, you know what, yeah, this is kind of difficult, so it's okay. Make a mistake, just give it a try. It's okay, right? Don't worry about grades. We're not going to be worrying about grades at this particular moment. Just give this a try. We gotta go somewhere and see what's going on. Okay, so provide reassurances and letting them know that mistakes are fine, right? Uh, I've pretty much said all these things, but again, that reminder that the academic stresses themselves can be their own source of bad stress. It's not good stress anymore if we're not able to have that recovery and have the the recovery, right? The sense of accomplishment, followed by recovery. If you're not doing that in a reasonable way, yeah, you're engaging in bad stress, and that is unethical at this point. Integrative emotional equity in 8 steps. So I have a whole video about social emotional learning and its limitations, and what the 8 steps that I think are in order to move towards a more thriving community, using the thriving theory as the base for what we can do. Okay, so that's the social emotional video, and I'll put the link in the description for that. Okay. Now, one of the things that we do know, this is what I've been saying before, is that we do much better when we feel emotionally calm. When we feel emotionally calm, that's when cognitively we can do much better with learning itself. What teachers do need to do a better job of is really addressing the second stage there, which is alert. It's something that can get missed pretty easily because kids aren't really being super expressive about whatever it is that they're feeling at the moment. They might just be a little rattled, or they might be a little, I don't know, feeling anxious about something, right? So that is important to understand, because when we miss those moments, because they just seem so subtle, maybe we're trying to do a lot of other things in the classroom, normal, right? But because they seem so subtle, they are missed, and then those could be tripped right into the alarm stage, much more intense feeling. When kids are alert, they're not really going to do a lot of learning there either. They're going to kind of come in and out. When they miss something, it's going to cause them to feel even worse, even if that's not the original problem that they're dealing with. So, this is a good time for a teacher to sort of, one, recognize, and two, be able to help a kid feel more calm, if that's genuinely possible, not trying to control them. And that's the other part that I want to get to is we're not here to control kids' emotions. We are here to provide guidance and to help them. It's hard to manage emotions. Sometimes we do need guidance and support. We're not here to control anybody's emotions. Guidance is not the same thing as control. So let's be really clear about that, and let's not get into a place where we're trying to control for calm, just like we're trying to control for cognitive engagement and all the things we're trying to control for. I guess, again, in these softer ways, but they end up having that kind of an outcome result, right? So there really is a need for a joyful classroom experience, genuinely so. Kids really do need to come into a room where they feel like this is a joyful place to learn. Learning is joyful, and it should be. It will be challenging, but the challenges themselves can also be joyful. So building trust, positive relationships, and using humor often. If you're not building trust as a teacher with your students, then your students just don't trust you enough to do something that's challenging, or they're not going to trust you enough to be vulnerable, or really try, right? They're going to protect themselves. So that's really key. And then there's this other part, positive relationships. And I think this is crucial for teachers to consider as well, because there's been a lot of focus, especially because of PBIS, on positive behaviors and positive reinforcement to back up those behaviors, token economies and all that kind of stuff. It's very behaviorist in its approach. Behaviorism is really controlling, off-putting, and it has very negative consequences on relationships. It makes us feel like we're not really connected to the person, that they're just trying to control us. So yay, we have 15 rewards, or 15 positive checks on the board. So now we all get to wear pajamas for next day of school. Okay, not the worst thing in the world, but there's a certain level of I'm trying to control you as a group, and then if you are controlled, then you get to wear pajamas for school or whatever. That's not the best message, and it's really a sort of lowbrow, very low hanging fruit, and not even really in the good sense approach. But positive relationships can do so much more in such a deep way because they're built on care. They're built on something genuine. It's not built on control. It's built on humanizing each other and sort of a core humanity running through. So, look, I mean, positive reinforcement. We've been doing this one to death. It 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 makes people feel manipulated. Whereas positive relationships are the best thing that you can actually have, because a kid will a positive relationship is going to include the sense of trust. So a kid, when they have difficulty, feels like they can be real in front of you, that you're going to care for them, and that they can actually grow from whatever it is. And certainly, last but certainly not least, here is using humor. Humor is such an important part of life. And even when we deal with difficult things, a lot of times we use humor to try to deal with the difficult thing. It makes it just easier and it humanizes it. So, not just consider using it, but everybody does humor in their own way. So, really tap into what humor is for you as a teacher, right? I can't teach somebody how to do humor in the classroom, but I can have them tap into the humor that's already within them. That's a bit different. And then there's this whole bit about when to use sarcasm, when not to use sarcasm. Sarcasm is good when it's something that talks about sort of our common experience, but it's not good when I'm talking about your experience, specifically your experience, because it might make you feel worse about your experience or your decision making or the sort of core values of who you are. And sarcasm, you have to be really careful about the way in which you do it, but if it's something that we're experiencing together, sarcasm might be a little bit of a funny way of dealing with that. But, use it very thoughtfully. So, student well-being's effects on cognitive engagement. I mean, it's one of the most powerful aspects of what affects us with our cognition. Our thinking part is really compromised when our well-being is low, right? So, you see very similar things that we've talked about before, but which is in a way, as I said before, is very good. It's nice that providing continuous supportive caring relationships is going to have all these implications at all these different levels. That's a good thing. So you can sort of read through that. And I've talked about a lot of this already. But again, the other part of this is regular experiences of challenges and accomplishments. So you want to get into the pattern of challenge, accomplishment, recovery, challenge, accomplishment, recovery. That's the pattern that builds trust within oneself, which is to say that there's a higher level of self-efficacy that will form from that too. So it's not just that we're shifting from bad stress to good stress, but then there's also other ripple effects that happen in our individual well-being. Okay, so and then using our goals and accomplishments as a foundation that can propel us forward. That's amazing, right? Don't worry, you've done this before. You've faced a challenge before. You were great at it. Look at the accomplishment that came out of it. Here we go. We're gonna do this again, and I know you're gonna. Even if you get stuck, I know you have it in you to be able to do this, right? And then I haven't talked about it much, but the self-pacing piece. One of the things that makes us more successful is when we have the ability to work on something in our own time. Not forever, but some flexibility of pacing. And that's something that really does need to be worked into school a bit more. And I have seen that happen a bit more. There's more choice. There's more, if you do less, that's okay. If you do more, that's okay. But just show that you can do it. Those are minor ways, but important ways of dealing with self-pacing. So those are good things. Keep bringing that into the classroom. All right, curriculum instruction. So this is the last category And there's obviously a lot to this, and I've been talking for a long period of time already. I probably have to answer some emails or something, as you might have heard. Anyway, all right. So, what do we do here? This is about our thinking and what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. Okay, so we're really going to get into that now. So, here we go again with this. Let's start with the low hanging fruit, right? Um, I talked about it before, but in terms of sustainability, changing the lights in one's home and recycling are good, but they're low hanging fruit. They're not going to get us to a level of really being super sustainable. Do we do them? Absolutely. Of course we do them. We should do them. We should always do them. Do them. They're good to do, but they're not the answer to everything. So they're low hanging fruit. In the context of what it means to be integratively sustainable, or see things that are all connected and how they're influencing one another, in that context, that's much higher. Okay, but what we tend to do is overemphasize again certain low-hanging fruit things that are ultimately good, but not the answer to everything. So inclusion is good. Yes, we should absolutely do inclusion. Does it answer all the problems of social justice? No, it does not. But especially if inclusion just means becoming, a better, like everybody now gets to be a better capitalist. Like there's a limitation there, right? Inclusion, yes, but what are we doing now with that inclusion? So that's the kind of discussion that is needed, and I've done that in other videos. But inclusion, equity, and social justice in the context of not thriving is problematic, because now you're engaging perhaps in exploitation, you're engaging in maybe greed, power, right, whatever, because now all those things are sort of pointed at those outcomes. Sorry, they're pointed at those outcomes, and that's not really going to end up being real social justice. And the equity itself isn't really going to be equitable because it's going to be hurting somebody else in the process. And the inclusion itself is, yeah, you're included, but now somehow or other you're trying to use each other through competition and greed and whatever to, yeah, you get the point, right? So, liberation is the movement away from all of that. We're liberating ourselves from this greed, competition, ego driven, power driven society that we've built, moving towards thriving, genuine thriving, and that when inclusion, equity, and social justice are present in the thriving context, then yes, okay. But if we're not naming the context, then we're just by default putting it into this really problematic society that we have right now that has created all those problems. So anyway, longer discussion in other videos, but uh, cognitive engagement viewed exclusively in the context of cognitivism is low-hanging fruit. So right now there's this push to go back to cognitivism, and there has been for like the last 10 years of cognitivism has so many answers, brain-based thinking, where we can teach towards the way in which the brain works. Now, obviously there's some good to that. It's not all bad, but it's also low hanging fruit because there's more to it. Everything that I just talked about for the last however long it's been had so much more to do with the way in which all of those things influence the cognitive. But just talking about cognitive is low hanging fruit and it's missing a larger point. So where are we going with this, right? So cognitivism tends to look like this. The teacher has the truth, the right answers. The students have the brain that makes the memories, and that's all cognitivism of how those memories get made. And then there's a standardized thought or standardized content that their memory has to sort of regurgitate. Well, okay, that's very low hanging fruit. As a learning theory, it's incredibly limited and myopic in its view, right? And so, as I was saying before, there are very cognitivist oriented tools and anyway, they're fine, but they're not going to do all of the heavy lifting and dealing with larger problems. So again, said it before, um, educational technology is a very helpful and interesting tool. It is. And it may engage some more kids who weren't there already. So great, okay. But it's not dealing with the larger problems that are really taking away and from who we are, and there's more important things here. But this can be part of what we do, right? There's also been for a while, there's been this discussion about we need more bodies in order to learn. True, absolutely true. I agree with that. But again, it's not going to solve all the problems, right? So these little things that we sort of keep bringing in, brain breaks, and we put a film, or we find a video, and the kids, jump around to the video, and they're cutting pineapples and right, flying pineapples, and we're going to cut them up. It's great. It's fun. I'm glad we're doing them. Great. But again, they're just one small part of a grander landscape of things that we have to think about that would give us a much greater positive impact, right? So anyway, so there's some things here. I talked about Finland before, mindful movements and creating emotional peace. We talked about mindfulness. I haven't talked about it, but we have been talking about mindfulness in the classroom and the effects of that. I would sort of say, look, if you're a district and you don't have recess through 8th grade, I would say really try to think about that, because you really do need to have just this at least 20 minutes a day of just running around and being free from structure, right? Uh, Academic structure, I mean. Okay. Anyway, and then PE should be year round, and I also think that health class should be really separately taught. Like, don't take away a quarter of the year of PE so that you can teach health. Have health be something that is taught while PE is also happening. So you would have 2 periods, 1 period for health and 1 period for PE. You get the idea. Again, I know that's asking a lot. Sometimes resources aren't there, time's not there, and all that. But ultimately, we do need body movement. I'm all for it. I'm just saying it's not everything, right? So that's from a very cognitivist point of view. The body movement is sort of considered just from the cognitivist point of view. Well, not just, right? There's a health component and all that, but the way in which it's framed when we talk about it. Okay, constructivism is also low-hanging fruit. I might be like, whoa, this is it. This is the bread and butter of teaching. What are you doing? Okay, so the structure here with the learning theory tends to be engage kids with their prior thinking, right? What are they already bringing to the classroom on this topic? And then when we've investigated that as teachers, we scaffold and move them towards the right answer, the truth, right? The list of right answers. And then their schema is reoriented and reconstructed with now the right answers in it. And then again, they need to show that sort of new that schema is now represented against the standardized thought, which is to say they take a test. Did they get the right answers? Right. So again, very limiting, even though we've expanded some portion of that out in the beginning, but we're not there yet. So if you look at the two of them, the outcome doesn't change, right? It's still measuring against some sort of standardized curriculum thought, what have you, right? So, okay, another video I've done on this, but let me do a quick review. Divergent thinking is the name of the game here. So you do need to converge on some understanding, whether it's the content, whether it is the right answers, whatever. We absolutely need to do that. But for what purpose? And if our purpose is so that we can become a more just more actively engaged democratic participant in a thriving community, if that becomes our larger goal, then you absolutely need divergent thinking as a major part of the learning experience. So what that looks like is you still start off with the prior thinking, and now instead of it being all truth all the time, now there's some information there that we definitely need to know, because without that information, we're not gonna get too far without that information. You can't really do heart surgery if you don't know what the heart looks like, or you get the idea, right? So you do need the right answers, as it were, but that's not the end all be all. And when you change that, you change the whole dynamic and feeling of what school is about. So now what we're doing is we're doing some critical questioning around the information. Where did it come from? Why do we think this way? Does somebody benefit from us continuing to think of it this way? Is there Eurocentrism in history, for instance, right? Is there a patriarchy? Is there an androcentrism? Are men at the center of the stories all the time? Is there sort of a white supremacy running through that we keep not addressing, but it's there? You get the idea, right? That's critical questioning. Is this taking away from our individual well-being? Could also be critical questioning. Anyway, you need to also connect with the communities, and this is where community-based teaching comes from. I know I'm doing a lot in this video, right? But if the question is still, how can we positively help our kids, with their cognitive engagement? Community-based learning is where it's at, my friends. Really digging into what's going on in their communities is way more engaging than some sort of abstract, decontextualized curriculum that just exists within the walls of the classroom. So I know that's a lot of work, and I know it's a lot of rethinking for teachers, but little at a time, right? This is something that we can do. When you connect with the communities, guess what? You're automatically doing some divergent thinking. Well, this person said this, and we saw that happen, and we saw some data around this, and we saw some experiences around that. We have artists who are talking about it this way. We have politicians who are talking about it that way. That is all divergent thinking. And it is rich. It is dense. You can't capture it all, but man, are you creating awesome thinkers by doing that. And then they can start to talk about the new relationships that they're seeing within their communities based on this information. Well, we think about this, and we think about that, and we think about it this way. And here's some context where we want to go this way with it. And other contexts we want to go that way with it. Well, guess what? Those are not right answers anymore. That's how we're trying to live together as a community. And that is super powerful and right there. And if you got this far in the video, I commend you, because I know this is super long. Oh my God. But this is where it's at. All of it is leading towards this, right? All of the classroom climate, all of the way in which we feel about ourselves, the self-efficacies. So now you have this structure of how learning can happen. This is a learning theory. Critical constructivism, okay? Now, when we talk about things like project-based learning, now we're doing something that's pretty amazing, right? Because now it's in the context of thriving community-based understandings. Community-based learning is so amazing because you're building people to be part of their community, and they're going to thrive more, right? Now we understand what's going on in our community. We can work together. This is great. But look what other options we have here. Open-ended learning, generative learning, art-based learning, using art to do some divergent thinking, because artists do that beautifully. Problem-based learning, relational learning. How does this relate to that? How does this relate to that? How am I related to this? And how's history related to us? Anyway, experiential. Somebody get my email, please, for the love of God. Experiential learning, of course, right? But if it's in the context of divergent thinking within the community, what, right? Path-based learning. What is that, Dr. Love? That is connecting with kids on an individual level and the paths that they want to desperately pursue in their own life and grow into, that person, that best version of themselves. Path-based learning. Oh my God. What would that be like? How can we as teachers engage with that, right? And contribution-based learning. I've talked about this before, but I'm talking about it now. What if the end goal, instead of passing a test, is providing some level of meaningful contribution to our society? Now we're getting somewhere. This is the kind of experience I would love to have as a student. I would love for my kids to have, right? On the right side, real-world connections, right? Aiming for divergent perspectives, talked about already. Genuinely interesting topics that are aimed at making a difference, as opposed to things that we just have to pile into our heads that we can find on the internet, right? Topics that ask us to grow individually and together, and topics of well-being. Theirs is cool. Let's do that. So, last thing I'm going to do here is show you what I mean. Here's an example. And I've done this in the Learning Theories video too, but I'm going to do it here as well so you can see. So, teaching about the cell, right? If we're using, and I took behaviorism out, that was in the other video, but I took behaviorism out. basically what we're doing here is we're finding ways to memorize the different parts of the cell. That's what cognitivism would be about, right? Okay? You can pause and read through this if you like. Constructivism is basically doing the same thing, except that you're working in small groups, except that you're connecting with prior thinking more than you would be in cognitivism. Not that cognitivism would be against that. I don't want to say that, but okay, right? So we might be doing some things that are a little more connected to ourselves individually. But look at the dramatic difference when we go to critical constructivism. Remember, critical constructivism is the base learning theory for thriving theory. Okay, this would be the learning theory that helps us get to this thriving community that I'm saying I'm valuing, right? That's where this is at. So if you're aiming towards divergent thinking, if you're aiming towards understanding what's going on and what has happened within our society, you're not just learning about the dang cell anymore by itself, because the cell by itself has virtually no real value in everyday life. Certainly not in a thriving community where people are trying to make really important decisions together about how we go about conducting our community together. So let's look at this, okay? Core teaching philosophy. First of all, if you don't know about philosophy, you gotta do that. But you're doing existentialism, you're doing critical race theory, feminism, eco justice, and then theories of sustainability. All of that is playing into what we're going to teach here. So are you ready for this? You're like, Dr. Love, this is a cell. Like, how can all those things be happening? We'll watch. Students will examine science in the context of equity, inclusion, and justice for the purpose of becoming a scientifically literate community member who works democratically with others towards thriving. So, yeah, like we're still doing equity, inclusion, and justice. We're doing those things. But they're in the context now of thriving, not in the context of becoming a capitalist, not in the context of becoming, like, oh, you can be a STEM worker for somebody who, you help them make $1 billion and, you're middle class. No, right? You still gonna need to get a job, whatever. But we're gonna transition, right? As human beings, I'm saying this right now. We are gonna transition. We are gonna do this. We are gonna become a more thriving species among other thriving species. Okay. So if we're doing that, then it can't just be about making the dollars. That's what we're trained to think right now, and that's depressing. So, core teaching methods. Here we go. Students will examine cancer clusters, Tuskegee, research ethics, Henrietta Lacks, Rachel Carson, Barbara McClintock, and Rosalind Franklin. Okay? They will, because many cases this is about patriarchy in science research, right? Rosalind Franklin especially. They will investigate our local community's views on cell-based issues like stem cell research, chemical fertilizers, genetically modified foods. Okay, more than that too, but obviously we can look at things like viruses and how they compare to cells. They will compare the structure and the function of a healthy lung cell with a cancerous lung cell. They will research They will research consumer-based practices that lead to cancers. They will develop personal plans for their own cellular health and community plans for cellular health. Ooh, right. So the cell is now a platform. Well, you got to know the parts of the cell, and you got to know that as sort of a base, right? It's a cornerstone for understanding all these things. We're not done yet. Almost done. Promise. Core assessments. Students have to do a test on basic cell organelles early in the unit, so we're not getting rid of that. We still need to have that going on. But they need to do it in order to give them a base for understanding the larger project of increasing personal and community cellular health and equity issues. Pause for a second. That's an amazing project, and if it culminates in having kids talking about these issues at a community event at the school, and you have people who have this kind of expertise that can come to the school, maybe you do, maybe you don't, I don't know, but if you can, that would be amazing, right? Imagine that at a middle school level, and it's not just here's an organelle, here's what the chromosome does. No, when it's really about cellular and community cellular health, that is an amazing experience to have, right? And that's something that we don't do. It's usually about some sort of pride presentation. I'm so proud of my kid. I'm so proud, right? I'm proud of the work that my students did. Look at what they did. The very rarely does a science fair ever culminate in something that was actual research, that was like meaningful research. Anyway, so that's what this is about. Really connecting to an issue that's greater in our community and probably beyond. So, connection to real world. In real terms, this is in preparation of becoming an involved democratic community member who has high scientific literacy. In order to become a more thriving community, there is a need to increase knowledge and awareness in order to help with personal and collective cellular health. Answer my email already. The community extends to nature as it is our home and needs to remain in balance. Right? We need this balance in our life. We are, I do research with kids in the summertime where we go around looking at river health, and we find that there's pollutants in the river. Why? Because people are putting chemicals into their lawns and it's running off into the rivers, and it's right. That's real. It's meaningful. It's data that is part of the community. It's not some sort of decontextualized abstract set of skills, or not even skills, but just straight up content that is just in our head. And that's it. So our cellular healths need to have humans seen as part of nature, and nature as part of the vital part of community. That's an example I just gave about the rivers. And then this is more than just getting a highly paid STEM job after college, which is right now seen as social justice, and that's what I mean by the ideology of greed, right? If that is the end goal, then you're in a greed ideology. If your end goal is to have people who are scientifically literate, because that will they can engage in the collective projects of working on their collective ecosystem. Now we're talking about something that's about thriving, right? The highly paid STEM job after college thing is just straight up greed. What can we do tomorrow? So I'm just ending on this slide because, and I've said all of these things before, but there are things that you can start to do tomorrow, right? Obviously, the social emotional thing is something that you can work on right away. How can I be a good human in my classroom? How can I be a support to my students? And that will up community engagement. It will, but not by itself, right? We have other issues here. If we aim our curriculum and instruction towards thriving, if we are taking district-wide approaches to figuring out what the needs are and what appropriate, thrive-oriented solutions might be, or responses might be, or practices might be, that's going to do a lot more in terms of cognitive engagement than some of the low-hanging fruit stuff, which is just, cognitivism based. So, okay, whew, I am stopping there. That took about 5 days, and I gotta go check some email or something, I guess. All right, talk to y'all later. And as always, may the force be with you.